traditional IT environment and what some of the new things that are happening in terms of technology, virtualization technology, multiple cloud technologies that are going to make that a little bit different, in some cases more difficult, in some cases just different. So the first thing that happens is, we used to talk about having network, and there was a way to have a demarcation between the network and a server, right? The demarcation was where that port stopped on the server. And then you'd have, up here you'd have your application that would live on top of that. And in some cases you had a single server or a cluster of servers dedicated to an application. Now, the first place where this begins to change as we do virtualization, one of those foundational technologies for cloud computing, is a couple of things change. Well, I still have the network, but where the network goes actually extends up into the server now. Because if I'm doing virtualization, right, that virtualization layer has network switching, network capabilities, could be network security, could be network switching, but now my demarcation point has changed, right? So I now have to be able to manage from a security perspective an environment where my demarcation point has changed. The next piece of this that changes a little bit is that application that used to be associated with a single server or a single well-known cluster of servers might actually move. So it may move for load balancing reasons, for high availability reasons, for a bunch of reasons, for compliance reasons, or for downtime reasons. It actually might move. It's what's sometimes called vMotion, live motion. Well, what that means is if I had security policies that were associated with this application for this network port, for example, well, those things have to dynamically move. So I'm now going to have, again, a network for how this gets to it, demarcation point up into the server, but I've got to be able to figure out how do I move not only my demarcation point in the network, that policy with the network and that application, how do I deal with this thing moving? So again, a new security challenge. So not only do I have where it went moved, right, where I troubleshoot, where I apply security policy, but the application itself can move. And when the application can move, that means I've got to be able to have policy that is able to move with that in some way. Otherwise, I may find that this network port is configured different than that one, and it doesn't have the right security policy on it, it doesn't have the right filtering capability or even monitoring capability. So as things like virtualization allow applications to move around my infrastructure, that becomes the first sort of security challenge, is when I've got movement, I can't necessarily easily or as easily pin down where resources are, where policies are aligned to resources. So you're going to have to be able to get a handle on how do I deal with mobility in an environment like this for security. The next thing that we have is we used to have, sort of single application against a server. Now we have multiple applications living on a server, right? We virtualize those applications or that operating system, and we get into a situation where how do we validate, how do we make sure that this application isn't doing bad things to that application? In the past, if we had a scenario where things were isolated, we knew how to put security in between here. We knew how to do that. We did that with firewalls, we did that with intrusion detection, but when they're on the same physical box, we may not necessarily have visibility to how things are going on. Back channels are happening, how an attacker can get into the box and look at this traffic. So this becomes another point where I've got to figure out how do I apply security that used to be here and apply it to here, right? How do I make sure that I don't have noisy neighbors where one application overtakes everything for good reasons or bad reasons? How do I make sure that one application isn't snooping the traffic of another application? How do I make sure that it's not masquerading to be the wrong application? So I've got to be able to replicate what we used to do in silos now within a server where I have multiple applications. So that becomes a second point, right? We have mobility being an issue. We have coexistence being an issue, right? And then the next thing we begin to have is what do we do if, and that's all within, say, a single rack or within a single data center, right? And those are fairly simple things, but they are fairly complicated in terms of how do I manage that? How do I, the next question becomes, now what happens, before I had physical devices that would do this. I'd have an intrusion detection system. I'd have a firewall system. Well, now, when these things move up into the server, this functionality probably has to become software. It either has to become software, so a software instantiation, firewall, intrusion protection, load balance, or whatever that is, or I'm going to have to do some very, very crazy things in terms of architecting how my traffic goes into a server and into an application, it comes out of an application, such that I have visibility for it to apply security policies. So the third piece that happens is, in many cases, a lot of our security elements are going to become software. And so we have to be able to move the thinking from what happens when this is a hardware device, a physical device, to a piece of software. How do I make sure that it's in compliance? How do I make sure that it's patched properly? How do I make sure that it's actually there? Because I can't physically see it anymore. It lives within something else. So we have those three things: mobility, coexistence, and moving from hardware to software for our security as three really key important things. And this is just within, like I said, within maybe a rack, within a single data center. Now, things get a little more interesting, actually a lot more interesting, when we start to think about, well, what if I want to interact with multiple clouds, right? Or if I have an application that is going to become more of a cloud type of application. It's going to be a distributed application. It's going to interact with a lot of different things to provide a very interesting type of experience. So now I'm no longer thinking about maybe just purely client server where it's an endpoint, it's an end user that has credentials that's trying to access this and sort of well-known client server traffic models. Maybe I have an application that's really made up of a bunch of